Hello and welcome, listeners, to our 1-year anniversary episode of That's a Good Card. Thank you so much for supporting us through 52 weeks straight. I want to really give a shout out to Ya for sticking through this with me for 52 weeks straight and not missing a single one. So big shout out to my co-host Ya, who doesn't know I'm recording this. So thank you so much for everything that you do to support this pod and support this passion project that we have. And thank you all to the supporters and listeners that tune in every week. And special thanks to the people who comment as well as talk and create good conversations in our Discord and even play games with us in the Discord. So this entire project that we started a year ago is now turned into a wonderful little community. So thank you so much, everyone out there who supports the podcast. And I hope you enjoyed this special episode of That's a Good Card. And make sure you stick around to the end, where we're going to talk about this last year as well as our thoughts and plans for next year. So cheers to this past year, and let's cheers to another full year, hopefully, of wonderful CEDH content and good cards. Thank you.
Hello and welcome, listeners, to the 1-year anniversary episode of That's a Good Card. We did it, folks.
We made it.
We consistently posted once, sometimes twice at the beginning, a week for the last full year. Who would have thought we would have gotten here? My name's Yaw, and this is my landfall-triggered co-host, Kyle. And he's going to have the challenge, as always, of getting me to say, that's a good card. While Kyle will be doing the convincing, I'll be playing the devil's advocate. Also, to celebrate our 1-year anniversary, make sure you stick around for our special closing segment. Ooh. Now is also a good time to remind you to hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to us. If you have thoughts that differ from the two of us, leave a comment below and let us know. Or you could suggest the card you think can change the CEDH meta. All right, Kyle, let's get started on our 52nd episode.
Whoop, whoop. All right. Yes. Congratulations, yeah. You made it. You survived a year.
I survived a year.
Co-host with me. Sucks. I'm just kidding.
Dude,
I'm just
awesome.
kidding. But I know it's been a wonderful ride. And we're going to talk about a lot of things at the end in our special closing segment. So make sure you stick around for that. But we have a super special card for today's episode, and it used to be a goated card in the CEDH meta. It used to be an absolute banger, and we are seeing a slight uptick in resurgence of this card. And especially so for me, because I just got absolutely destroyed by this card the other day. So the card we're going to be talking about today is brought to us by Anna, aka PHYREXIAN Fangirl, who was the inspiration for this card because she was the one who completely stuffed my win attempt with this.
Awesome.
So today's card is Faerie Macabre. Faerie Macabre, for those of you who don't know, maybe you're newer to CEDH within the last couple of years. This, like I said, used to be a pretty prominent card. Let's talk about what it does. So it is a 3-cost creature, Fairy Rogue. It costs 1 colorless and 2 black pips. And it has flying. It's a 2/2. And the important part of the text for this card is that it has an activated ability. It says, discard Faerie Macabre, exile up to 2 target cards from graveyards. And the flavor text reads, the line between dream and death is gauzy and fragile. She leads those 2 near it from one side to the other.
So poetic.
Ooh, it is pretty poetic. And there's also a couple of judge rulings for this card. One of them states that you're using this activated ability from your hand, so you have to discard it from your hand to activate it. And then the other one states that the targets for it can be 2 different graveyards. So you don't have to pick the same person. 1 card in one graveyard, 1 card in another graveyard.
Correct.
So just to clarify that.
Yep.
Cool. So let's talk about where we see this card. Now, CEDH Analytics shows this card in a little under 30 decks. It's seen mostly in Talion and Yuriko, which makes sense. I personally have seen this in the wild, like I was alluding to before. When playing against Ana, I see this in Ana's Sephiroth list, which it has awesome synergy in Sephiroth. Yeah, so you're able to trigger Sephiroth by putting the creature to the yard, which is super awesome. And it's like one of those like added bonus synergies that just makes this, it takes the card over the top, you know.
What does Sephiroth do real fast?
So Sephiroth of the Hidden Ways is a 3-cost legendary creature human wizard. It's a 2/3, and the cost is Esper. So it's a white pip, a blue pip, and a black pip. And Sephiroth reads, whenever one or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, venture into the dungeon. This ability triggers only once each turn. To venture into a dungeon, enter the first room or advance to the next room. And then a second ability, create undead. Whenever you complete a dungeon, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. I'll throw up on the screen the token that shows the path for the dungeon, but basically, for those of you who haven't played against venturing into the dungeon often, there's a bunch of different things that happen at every step along the way, and you kind of tick down and do different things. There's a scry, and there's just a bunch of different things. Like I said, I'll throw it up on the screen. I'm not going to list out every single thing. But basically, Sephiroth is a reanimator list, right? So when you're using that second ability, when you finally complete the dungeon, so after a certain amount of creatures have been put into your graveyard, or you're using other synergies to venture into the dungeon or complete/advance the dungeon, you'll be able to bring big things back from the graveyard to the battlefield. So Faerie Macabre is super nice in this because, like I said, you're able to trigger a venture into the dungeon or advancing in the dungeon from hand, which is pretty sweet. The other list that I wanted to shout out is my own old OG Nath Stacks Golgari list, which this card was in that list, is an absolute banger. Shout out to the Nath players out there. If there's anyone listening who still plays Nath Stacks, you're the real MVP.
Please,
because
please
I
let
don't.
Us know. Please let us know down below.
I absolutely love that list. You're playing like Chains of Mephistopheles and stuff like that. That's just such a cool list. If you're still enjoying that, you're the real MVP. So that's also another list that it could potentially see play in if Nath was played still, but it's kind of not. But anyway, I digress. Let's get into my points for this card. Are you ready?
Yep, totally ready.
Cool. All right. So my first point as to why this card is so powerful is the blatantly obvious point, which is that it's interaction for graveyard pieces. So Graveyard Hate is pretty effective in this current meta. 2/ I would say 2.5 of the most powerful ways to win games, at least in the pods that I have been playing in and the tournaments that I have seen recently, have been Breach lines, Hazel's Brewmaster lines. Specifically, this is like TNT, but I see a ton of TNT. And then Agatha's lines are also seeing a ton of resurgence. I know we play against Ob a lot, and Agatha's Soul Cauldron is a super valuable card in that. Also, shout out Priscilla for their Cauldron list, which also abuses how great Agatha's Soul Cauldron is as a card to find wins through Cauldron itself.
Shifting Woodlands?
Yeah, Shifting Woodlands is also huge. I mean, for me personally, I've been playing a Dredge list with 6 Life from the Loan, Corvold, and either a Lotus Petal or Lion's Eye Diamond. So that's for me one of the most powerful win conditions that my Corvold list has. And I can go on and on. There's so many different win lines that utilize the graveyard right now, just floating around. And even the ones that aren't necessarily a instant you win the game, but ones where you're, reanimating a Razaketh, quote unquote win the game. Like that's your win line. But there's just a lot of big value things that are also coming out of the yard. So I know you have mentioned this. I believe it was on the Surgical Extraction episode. Could have been a different episode as well. But just Graveyard Hate is just so hot right now because it's so effective.
Yeah,
so if you're looking for another piece, then I think that Faerie Macabre is something that might be back on the menu. Do you think I missed any major win lines that play out of the yard? I was trying to think if there's any other big ones. Oh, how about Abdel Adrian? You've been playing that a lot, right?
I have definitely played it a lot.
Yeah, so Bomberman, I mean, this is pretty effective against that too, especially if you're like someone's like early entombing Abdel Adrian. I mean, that could be pretty effective against Bomberman too.
This is the type of card that would make me kind of sweat a lot, actually. Like cards that do that are a Rest in Peace, Dranith, right? Things that just stop you from using that
Hard
other
stop.
hand,
Yep.
your other hand, right? This is one of those cards that I think, as Kyle loves to say, is like, surprise, got you.
Gotcha.
You're going to play around a Graph Digger's Cage, you're going to play around a Dranith, or wait to try to remove them. This is not something that you can really remove, right? You kind of have to know what is in a person's hand, and you're just never going to see this coming. Not in 2025.
Yeah. Not in 2025, you won't. I think that kind of leads into my second point is the effectiveness of this as an interaction piece is twofold. One, it's difficult to interact with because it's an activated ability. And activated abilities in itself, like anyone who plays Boseiju or Odawara, especially, like you understand how powerful
So
it can
good.
be,
So good.
where a force of will can't hit this thing. So that's the first point of why this is such an effective interaction piece, or why it's difficult to interact with. And the second part is just like the potency. You're exiling this card. It's gone. It's in the no-no zone. It's gone. So it's not like a counter spell in terms of interaction where you counter it, it goes to the graveyard, and there's a chance they're bringing this thing back. No, it's gone. It's exiled. Bye-bye. I guess if you're playing Karn, the Planeswalker that can bring something back from exile, right?
There's
That's
one
a thing.
other
Question
card
mark?
that could. There's only
Yeah.
one other card that.
Pull from Eternity,
Yep,
right?
that's it. And nobody plays that,
But I
right?
don't think
Nobody plays
nobody's
that.
playing that. No. So it's gone. And just something to think about as well with this card. I didn't put it as a point, but it's kind of like since I'm talking about just like the effectiveness as an interaction piece in this whole point, I'm kind of jamming a bunch of points into one. I want to talk about how it's a 1 for 2 cards, which is not the worst rate. Like ideally you'd want to be able to effectively interact with all 3 of your opponents at the same time, kind of similar to how a Dranith does, right? Where you will affect 3 players, potentially. Now, you can make arguments on how Dranith affects certain decks over others. That's totally fine. The point, what I'm trying to say is like the rate of the card of like, I lose a card and I'm removing 2 potentially extremely valuable cards from someone else. I think that's just like a good rate in general. Especially the fact that you're able to deal with 2 people at once. Like for me, when I got blown out, my Lotus Petal was removed right before I'm about to do my 6 dredge lines. So on a hit, my Lotus Petal, and then at the same time hit Scylla's, I believe it was a Gilded Drake or a Volatile Storm Drake that was being targeted to be reanimated, which would have probably grabbed something absolutely enormous and 100% of the time, like she would have ran away with the game. So I don't know if there's any other. There's very few interaction pieces that can hit multiple people at once, and I think that because it's graveyard hate, the likelihood that there's multiple good things to exile is like really high. Because generally speaking, on how like graveyard win lines go, like there's got to be some sort of setup to it. So you have to like entomb something first, right? Sure, there's ways to like naturally mill into it, but in terms of like playing out of your yard lines, generally they're a little more telegraphed because it's open information. So because they're more telegraphed, the likelihood that you have multiple things to hit is higher. But that's my second point, is that as an interaction piece, it's efficient. It's very difficult to interact with, and when it goes through, it hits hard. That's it. That's my second point. Any other thoughts on like just like the potency of it as an interaction piece?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's one of those effects where there was a card in Timid Jessica I used to really like. It was Lightning Axe, I believe. Pay a red.
Oh, yeah, Lightning Axe. I'll read it. It's a red mana as an additional cost to cast Lightning Axe, discard a card, or pay 5 colorless mana. Then it deals 5 damage to target creature.
I know. This is not the same, but it's kind of really cool because like that card was a way to kind of do removal and get rid of a card into the bin, right? Like to entomb something
that you wanted to
entomb anyways, right? So I love that. Now this is obviously just discarding itself, but it's like I'm getting rid of this card.
But it is putting a creature in it. That's not nothing. If you're going for your own breach line, for example,
right,
or you need to hit Delirium on your own Shifting Woodland, or you need to hit Threshold for your Cabal Ritual, those are all, relevant
Threshold
things.
For a Cephalid Coliseum to save yourself from losing a game to a Thassa's Oracle to make them draw. Like, that's rather huge, right? Hard to see coming because your opponents don't normally think about you discarding something affecting them right away.
Could you imagine the edge case where there's like an effect that says that your opponents can't cast spells and you see a Cephalid Coliseum? You feel safe. You're like, oh, they have a Cephalid Coliseum, but they haven't met the threshold. I'm totally safe to rip this Thassa's. And then you can just activate an ability from hand, put a creature into your yard, meet threshold, activate Cephalid Coliseum. Thassa's player loses a game.
Okay.
That's such an edge case, but I love it. I love the idea that could possibly happen.
It can happen.
And for those listeners, Cephalid Coliseum is a land that requires threshold to be met, which is a certain number of cards into your graveyard.
7, I think. 7.
When you activate it, a target player draws 3, discards 3.
Yep.
And if someone has exiled their entire library and then are playing Thassa's Oracle, if you force them to draw, they lose.
Yep.
So that's why it's super potent. But anyway, are you ready for my third point?
Yeah.
We should get into my fringe points here. So I've got the meat and potatoes. So now we're getting into the appetizers, or maybe this is the dessert. The dessert. My third point is that there's less stifle and trick bind effects now that Dockside's gone. So it kind of adds to the point of the effectiveness of this card of being difficult to interact with. But I was just thinking about that the other day. It's like, dang, we really don't see any stifle or trick bind anymore. I wish we did, because honestly, we could probably do podcasts on both of those cards. But the fact that like nobody's playing those right now because you can't hit a Dockside that would make 8, like it's a really interesting edge case that just makes this even more of a uninteractable piece, right? Like the only thing that stops it right now is SWAT, basically.
Yeah.
Effectively. There's other things that change targets, but yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there, that the likelihood that someone actually can stop this is very low, and it goes down to like a handful of cards that can do anything. And to be honest, the players playing red probably aren't playing much out of their yard. So like a Magda player who would run Return the Favor, Deflecting SWAT, Untimely Malfunction. I think that does activated abilities as well.
I think that does.
Those ones, like the Magda probably doesn't care about whatever you're hitting, so they're not going to swat it away anyway. So
I don't think so.
Yeah. And then my last point is my fun point, which is this thing has flying, which is important because it can be in case of emergency, break glass, play it for 3 as a flying blocker so you don't die to a massive flyer like Obnixilis or Corvold or Tivit. Like, there's so many different things that can just absolutely fly over you and kill you. So, in case of emergency, break glass, Faerie Macabre can save your life. Cast this card. Yeah, or, hey, you're in black. So you could need to cast Diabolic Intent really, really badly. And you play this out and then sacrifice it. It's not nothing.
It's not nothing.
Pretty bad, but it's not nothing.
It's definitely not nothing. If you're in a bad spot, you're in a real bad spot if you're considering casting that. Now, that's speaking as a person who, over the weekend, thought, is this where I cast Vial Smasher and pass? Like, that's a bad place to be. And I'm telling you, listener.
Yeah. Or the old Silas pass.
Right, Silas pass.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Right.
We've all been there.
That's a fun point indeed.
For sure. Yeah, the last thing I just kind of wanted to throw out there, which is a point that I'm kind of thinking about on the fly right now, is when I'm just thinking about the decks that want to run this, I was kind of thinking about my own Corvold list. And something that's interesting, I don't know if I would test this in Corvold specifically, but what I will say is that in my deck building process recently, I have been really, really shying away from interaction that is easy to interact with. I'm favoring the things with split second. I'm favoring the things that can't be countered. Shout out to Abrupt Decay. It's the best card ever printed. Just kidding. It's close though.
I thought you said. I thought
but
that was Legolas's quick reflexes for you.
Also LQR. That card, a banger. Which I did. Yeah, this is huge update for the pod. I did finally sell my copy, my second copy of the Surge Foil LQR to the LGS, and guess what I bought with it? With part of the credit.
What's that?
You're absolutely right. A raised foil Lumra that they had staring at me in the case.
Did buy
baby,
that.
It's
Awesome.
beautiful. Listeners, hop in the Discord. We have a show off bling 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 section. You can see the raised foil Lumra that second copy of LQR got me. So anyway,
it's hot.
The final point I was saying is that I'm shying away from interaction that's easy to interact with. For example, like I think I would. There's an argument to be made if I wanted to slot in another interaction piece. These obviously do two separate things, but the first thing I can think of is a lightning bolt, right? So like a lightning bolt is a 1-cost instant spell. Instants get hit the most / second most, besides sorceries as well, in terms of common counter spells being played, right? It gets hit by dispels, it gets hit by flusterstorms. And then also the 1 CMC also puts it in another category of not only that, but now it's getting misstepped. So something like Faerie Macabre is not going to get hit by those kinds of things. So just some food for thought before I hand it off to you, yeah.
Well, are we ready to talk about some of the downsides or things you should consider before you slot this card in?
Absolutely. Dig into it.
So I think your last point, like something you just said is like, would you test this in Corvold or not? And I think that the cost of this card isn't really free. Yes, it's free to cast, but it's not free in the sense that it has to take up a slot in your deck. And like, yes, the whole point of this podcast and the whole point of this episode is to try to convince you that you want to put this card in like the 99 or 98, what have you.
In the 99th spot specifically.
This is very much, I think, a 99th card. And so in that case, it's not really free because like you are having to take something else out. Like, do you run this over surgical extraction? Do you run this over another card I learned called extirpate? Which is almost the same thing as sudden surgical extraction. Sorry. Yeah. But it costs 1, but it has one of Kyle's favorite mechanics, split second, and then it reads the same as surgical extraction, right? Exile a card, and then look through that person's hand and library for that card to exile them as well. So, and that one gives you information, right, on that person's hand.
I'll put it on the screen here.
And it gets rid of the thing. And so that does cost 1 black pip, but it gives you, again, what Kyle's kind of like describing here. It gives you a way to not be able to interact with it with split second, right? No abilities can go on the stack. No spells can go on the stack.
Yeah.
And it does something similar.
It's a big middle finger to those blue farm lists going for a Underworld Breach line where they have 15 cards in hand and 3 counter spells, and they can't do a dang thing about it.
Right. And so I think that what the point here is, you do have to really consider the makeup of your deck. If you're running an Adnaz, you probably don't run this over surgical extraction or extirpate, right? Because it's 2 extra pips. Yes, it's easier to cast the fairy, but it's also 2 more life that you might have to take, right?
That's big. I think that this kind of fills a similar role, and I'm not saying it's the same because I'll just say it. Noxious Revival kind of has a similar effect. Noxious Revival is much more versatile, where you can set up yourself, but it's also free Graveyard Hate in a pinch.
Right.
But the Graveyard Hate is less effective, but the versatility of being able to set yourself up is higher, right? So they're similar-ish. The Venn diagram is like slightly overlapping, but it's not like like fully overlapped like extirpate and
surgical
extraction, where those 2 cards are like almost fully overlapped in what they do.
I actually feel like that's a great point because I almost feel like, and I don't have the data to back this up, this is just a thought that I had right now. I almost want to, for me, say that Noxious Revival is probably the most run Graveyard Hate card. Like in like
probably
that's not the way
because
it's
of the
designed.
versatility,
right? It's so versatile.
Yeah.
Like
because of the versatility.
Somebody could be trying to surgically extract your card, and you're like, okay, cool. I'm going to Noxious Revival that card onto the top of my library, right? And so, I can't pull it out from my graveyard now, but I can get it later. That kind of a thing. And so,
Yeah, I mean, that could be a downside for Faerie Macabre,
Right.
is just the fact that there's zero versatility to it. This card
Right.
is really freaking effective
Narrow.
at doing the one thing.
Yes.
It's dang potent at doing that
Correct.
one thing. It does it really, really, really well, but it doesn't have that flexibility, that versatility, which, depending on your deck, it kind of just, it really depends on whether or not you really benefit from the versatility of the other options of Graveyard Hate, right?
And that kind of brings me to my second point, in the fact that this can then, because of that, feel like a little bit of a dead card. Especially, I think, early game, right? Early game, right? This is, I think, a banger mid to late game card. But early game, especially in a potentially a meta, like you drew it, and you're like, okay, cool. The rest of my hand is pretty good. There's no counter spells, but I have the fairy, so I should be okay.
Yeah.
But then you're caught with your pants down, in the sense of, like, somebody plays like a turn 2 Thassa's Demonic, and let's say there is a Ristic out, or like there is a fish out. You can't feed that fish, right, with this card, right?
Yeah.
So you can't feed somebody else that may be able to bail you out with this. Yes, it can't be interacted
with.
It's
wide open,
right,
to Thassa's Demonic. This thing is wide open to that. I will agree to that.
Right, but and like those have other ways that you can interact with it more. But like early game.
Let me think. Thinking of the early game point, there's actually only one situation of the early game where I think I would use this within the first or second turn cycle. And that is if somebody turn 1's Deathrite Shaman, and there are, like, let's say 1 or 2 fetch lands in the bin, right? If that deck is like a fast deck, like a turbo deck, I know that they need those lands in the bin in order to, like, have like their turn 1 on the, or they're like to turn 2 on the play, before they're untapping, I'm sniping those lands out of graveyard. So they're sitting there going, oh, that mana that I was relying on to get from my Deathrite Shaman, gone. Nope, no mana for you. I would 100% do that just to screw the turbo player. I think that's a good use of it, to be honest. I would rather do it then and allow the table to catch up and help deal with them than wait, let them do their thing, get into their breach line, and then stuff them once they've developed.
Kyle will do that. I'm telling you right now, he will absolutely do that.
Rip your lands out of your yard so that your Deathrite Shaman does nothing.
He will wait.
If you're like on the play,
right?
Like if you're like seat 1 or seat 2, you're probably getting rocked by the fairy. Cool. What's your next point?
Another point that I had, I kind of thought about, right? It's just to kind of talk about, like, deck makeup is, like, what is this replacing? Chances are your deck may already run a Grafdigger's Cage, but maybe it doesn't, because you also need to play out of the yard, right? But, like,
I don't know if that's the same vein. You think that Faerie Macabre and Grafdiggers is the same slot?
I don't think it's the same slot. Right, I don't think it's the same slot, but you're like, let's say you're already running like a Grafdigger's Cage because you don't care, but you want to keep people from playing. And now you played something, and like now it sticks around, right? Like now it's there, and yes, they have to deal with it, and it brings value right away, and it continues, like something you talk about all the time is it continues to bring value. Whereas this card, you're really having to wait, right? You're really having to wait to kind of make get them, like to make sure you
it's a silver
gotcha
bullet type,
right? Like it's real gotcha, and so it's gonna feel. I think that their listeners that slot this in will probably find games where they're gonna draw it. They're excited, like they can feel that situation coming, but like maybe that situation never quite gets there, and they're like, man, I kind of wish this card was something else.
It's the lack of versatility, right? And that's why it's so cool. I mean, like, when I've firsthand experienced the effectiveness of this card, it's in Sephiroth. And Sephiroth is, like, one of the only commanders that really is getting proactive value out of the card. Yeah. So in that list, it's extremely proactive. Right. And now it has gained versatility because of synergies. Are there a lot of things like that? Sure, we touched on some of them, like a Shifting Woodlands to get Delirium, or Threshold, whatever. Yeah. But it's pretty light in comparison. So I mean, I think it's an absolute banger in Sephiroth. But yeah, I kind of agree. I mean, thinking about what you're saying here, in terms of what slot is it going to take, my mind immediately goes towards, okay, and hear me out. This could be a crazy hot take.
I love it when you start with a like that. Go ahead.
Hear me out. Yeah. I would argue in lists that are playing, 8 to 12 counterspells, take out your shittiest counterspell. Dispel, gone. Get Dispel out of
definitely.
here for Faerie Macabre.
Yeah.
And my thought process is this, like right now, there's probably, especially in good stuff piles, there's probably no slot for dedicated graveyard hate. I don't think there's a single slot that is dedicated graveyard hate.
Can't say that there is.
Full stop.
Yeah, I don't think so.
But we're running 13 ways to counter something, but we're not running a single way to interact with a graveyard when someone else has a full hand.
Yeah.
Like, come on now. If you're going to lose the game in this massive stack war, it would be great if you could just ignore the stack war completely and stuff somebody in a way that they can't interact with. Because if you have 13 counterspells and they have 14 counterspells, it's like, what are you doing here? Right? Sure, you get to that point, and like sometimes you need the ability to break that awkward mid-range hellscape that's created when 2 people or 3 people have 20 cards in hand and a bunch of treasures from their Smothering Tides, and it's just an absolute mess, right? Faerie Macabre provides an avenue to stuff somebody even when they feel like they're ultimately protected.
No, I agree with that.
Is that crazy?
No,
to
no,
think
no.
Of that? It's
no.
like maybe the slot that we're taking is a counterspell slot.
No,
and I know people love their counterspells. Look, when I made my Talion list, I shoved 20 counterspells into the list because I was like, you know what? This is it. This is what the deck does.
Counter.
So I get it.
I
get it 100%. I love that I saw that some Talion lists were playing this because to me, I'm like, they are playing that many counterspells. Like eventually they have to have card slots that provide control in a different way. Like you have to be able to stop those other lines that aren't worried about casting instants or aren't worried about casting sorceries.
No, I think that's a really solid point because I have to back you up here. I have definitely been in the position where right now my deck of choice is Grixis Pirates, right? I love being like I think I was playing against you. I didn't care that somebody countered my Glinthorn with their Force of Will, right? Because I had Reanimate in hand. I was almost even praying that they would do it. Like waste it on this, waste the Force, a really strong spell on the counter. It's going to go to my graveyard, and then I'm going to just try to reanimate it and do it again. And so now you would really get me if you had the Force of Will and the Faerie Macabre, right? To I had to really think about that. To now exile my Glinthorn out of my graveyard. So
and let's talk about why you had to think about that real quick. That was a good time to tell the listeners that Yah and I were having a really hard time trying to figure out how to pronounce the name of this card.
Faerie Macabre? Faerie Macabre.
Macabre.
All right.
It's macabre. We had to look it up.
Listeners, if you were impressed, we worked on it.
Or, there's probably a lot of people. This rings true for anyone who reads fantasy. I read a lot of fantasy novels. So, and I know you do too, right?
Yeah, I do.
So, when you like get a name that's like this crazy outlandish name, so then you just guess in your mind, like this is how you pronounce it. And then you talk to somebody else or hear somebody say the name and it's completely different. And you're like, what the hell are you saying? That's not how you pronounce that name. Yeah. That's kind of how I bet you a lot of listeners are thinking right now.
Nope. Absolutely agree.
Or they're all like, nah, these two dudes are idiots. How do you not know how to pronounce macabre?
Because it's a weird word, right?
Anyway, we'll move on. Let's get to your last point, Yah.
All right.
Hit us with it.
The last point is more of like a, kind of want to say a PSA. I think
classic.
I think with this card, timing is everything. You almost genuinely want to wait. You want to wait till the person who is trying to get this card out of their yard, like if you think it's going to happen at sorcery speed, cool. Go ahead and do it on somebody's end step, whatever. But I think it's still better for them to target that thing. If somebody casts the Underworld Breach, cool, that's the time to do it. Go ahead. But
Or if a Kenrith is reanimating
That's when you
targeting a Gilded Drake to reanimate and steal my 2020 Corvold, get Faerie Macabre.
Right. And for those of you who are like, duh, I'm not talking to you because you're already a good player. I'm talking to players like me who had to learn that the hard way. All right. And you don't have to out yourself.
So are you
don't out
saying
yourself.
my Deathrite Shaman maneuver was bad and I should wait? Are you trying to counter that argument?
No. I think it's. I think like denying a Deathrite is like a beautiful thing. It's like I have only cast that card like twice. I'm not a huge fan of that card. I think it's a great card. Don't get me wrong. I'm just not a huge fan of that card personally. But like generally, just wait for them to target it.
Have patience.
Now, like they have to be able to like target it again.
Yeah.
Right.
Make them sink mana into it. Who knows? Like maybe they're, the Abdel is in the bin. They go to cast Necromancy. They tap out to do so. Now you hit them with it, right? Make it hurt.
Yep.
Punch like you mean it. I agree with that point. I mean, I'm 100% down to agree that this card requires impeccable timing.
All right, Kyle. Let's talk about what point of mind do you think makes the most sense for why this card could not make the cut?
I think it's the lack of versatility. We kind of stumbled into it, and I know that your second point wasn't necessarily like we kind of beat around the bush a little bit until we got to that point, right? Where we kind of realized like the easiest, cleanest way to describe the biggest downside for this is the significant lack of versatility. So, I get that. I recognize that it could be a little, how do I say this? It could be a little counter to some of the deck building that I've been doing, where I've been really liking cards that are versatile. Something that comes to mind a lot is I've been a really big fan of spree cards recently.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it's nice to have options early when you can afford it, but also it's nice in those longer games when you have a ton of mana to be able to just sink mana into something and get a ton of value. So, I understand it. I understand the lack of versatility. Like for me personally, when I'm thinking about this, if you're going to have Graveyard Hate in your deck, like you have this one card and that's really it. I don't think I would sink more card slots into specific Graveyard Hate.
Yeah.
I think that I would just be happy with having a piece to do it. And then having a couple of pieces of removal, having like a board wipe, maybe two if you're super controlly. Like that's kind of how I see it. But the lack of versatility is a real thing. So that's your best point.
Cool.
What point of mine did you like the most? What makes you kind of want to consider testing Faerie Macabre?
I actually have 2 points. Right, I'm going off script a little bit. It's the fact that it is really difficult to interact with, right? Like it's a creature ability, a creature card ability, right? And so you're discarding it, and so it's a very narrow. What's going to hit this thing? And the fact that there is so much graveyard love, right? Like so many people putting things in bins, like just willy-nilly, just like putting it into like layaway, right? Essentially, until they
especially things that are targeting in graveyards. We didn't talk. We kind of touched on it a little bit with like the thought of like a necromancy targeting Abdel Adrian, but like in order to put things on the stack that are targeting, you're investing a lot of resources into one specific target in a graveyard, right? I really like that. I just really like the ability to hose somebody in that scenario.
Yep. I think that those are really solid points for this card.
All right, y'all. It's that time. Did we change your mind? Is Faerie Macabre a good card?
I love these types of cards. And I think that this card is good with huge caveats.
What?
Yeah.
It's not even a tepid yes. This is good, but 7 asterisks.
No, I'm going to give it like 2.5, maybe 3 caveats.
2.5. Okay.
Right, like it is. You really have to know if your meta is super graveyard like heavy, cool. Run this card, right? Run this card, test it out. If you're not running ad nauseum, run this card, right? Like you can test this card out. There's still like a word where with ad nauseum you could, but like there are probably better options. And then 2, I do think something you said like last week or the week before, this is one of those I actually kind of feel like this is more of like potentially almost a tournament type card than it is a
interesting
casual CEDH card.
I thought you'd argue the other way, to be honest. I thought you'd argue like, hey, you have a pod, you know that it's a Reanimator list, a Obnix list that plays Agathas, and a Corvold that you play against every week. Like, yeah, slot this in. That's going to absolutely hose them. Interesting that you say it's more of a tournament card.
I do think so because, like, for me, the other, like, fun point that I actually would, like, say is convincing is, like, hey, no, sometimes you do need a fairly low-cost flyer so that you don't die, right? Like, I was one of those players this weekend that proved how Ragavan is such a great card. I was open for many turns, and I gave people a Necropotence. I gave them the One Ring. I gave them... Ragavan hitting me was just like, and I just needed a blocker.
And you would cast this? I don't know if you would ever. That's crazy. I don't think I would ever cast this unless it was like I was passing to somebody with lethal on me. That is like the only time I would. If there was a Ragavan out, there's no way I would do this unless it was like pure spite.
Hey, sometimes the tournament just goes that way. So yeah, like I said, I think that this is a good card. It's fun. It's nobody's gonna see this one coming.
Nobody's gonna see it coming.
Nobody's gonna see it coming.
The old heads know. Okay.
Yeah.
Is there any weight to that? Is like the fact that this used to be really good? Is there any weight to that? Like, do you think like, oh well, if it used to be, then there's weight to that. Like, it's probably
their comments are gonna be full of those. The comments are gonna be full like, oh
I
man,
know,
this card used to be good.
All
blah,
the
blah,
old
blah.
heads are gonna come out being like, this is why we don't see this anymore. Just like Carpet of Flowers. Yeah. It's a lot of people were off that.
Yeah.
This was like before the bans, they were off that, and that's when we talked about that card, because I think post-ban, Carpet of Flowers stonks have been way up. But anyway, cool. All right, y'all. It is time for the special closing segment for our 1-year anniversary episode. So congratulations on making it this far, and thank you so much for joining us in our final segment. The things we want to talk about are, 1, looking back and reflecting on this past year, and then 2, looking forward into the future. So a look back, a look forward. Let's talk about it, y'all. 1 year. And do you want to start off by giving everybody a special thanks?
Thank you so much for listening, for tuning in, for listening to two people talk about Magic cards that are super, super fringe. Like, if that's what you're here for, thank you so much. Thank you especially to anybody that has joined our Discord or come up and said hi. It's been really cool to get to know you all. It's really opened up my eyes on this community. Some people are kind of like a little bit doom and gloom on CEDH, but to me personally, and I think Kyle feels the same way, CEDH is in such a cool spot right now.
It's growing. It is still growing. Sure, a couple of leaves got shaken by an early winter, but I'm not going to say first winter because this has happened many times with other bannings in the past. But for many people, because it had grown so much in the past couple of years, there's a lot of people who this was their first ban experience in the format. So it's not all doom and gloom. This format is still a little sapling, right? It's still so small, but growing, and it has so much potential. And I also want to give a shout out to those of you who have recommended cards for us to review.
Thank you so much.
Because there's no way that Ya and I could just come up with banger cards to talk about every single week. Could we? Maybe. I don't know. I doubt it. Highly doubt it. Because it's just, there's so many Magic cards, and I just love hearing from people, just having them tell us like, this card is so good because of XYZ things. And I ask them, okay, what's the Magic Christmas Dreamland for this card? And they go, oh, well, it's this, this, this. And I go, whoa, that's awesome. Okay, let's talk about it, right? That's my favorite thing about this. Is it's just spreading knowledge, right? It's educational. It's great. It's great. But cool. Let's talk about looking back on this past year of That's a Good Card. What was your favorite part? The highlight of the year?
Meeting people. Absolutely. Right. Well, I let me back that up. The highlight of the year has actually been getting to this point. I think Kyle and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, was we weren't necessarily sure that we would actually make it a full year, right? Like, I'm so proud of Kyle and I for actually sticking to a schedule and doing this consistently week
Yep.
after week and actually doing the thing, right? And we've grown
Yep.
because of it. And so I'm really proud of that. And I'm so like happy to have met people. Like super highlight that happened over the weekend was somebody recognized me by the sound of my voice. That's scary to me and
At a
wild.
CEDH tournament.
At a CEDH tournament, I sat down, I said hello, introduced myself, and they were like, I recognize your voice. And that made me pause. So Will, shout out. Shout out to you.
Shout out. That's awesome.
How about for
That's
you, Kyle?
awesome. Yeah, I mean, my highlight was really similar. Meeting people, specifically at MagicCon. I had a
So good.
huge blast at MagicCon. Just jamming tons of games, meeting tons of CEDH creators, handing out a bunch of our That's a Good Card floating mana cards, which I now see across many spell tables and streams and content creators. Shout out to everyone who uses those floating mana
Thank
cards.
you.
If you see us at a tournament, ask for one of these cards. We keep them on us at all times, really.
All the time.
Like, don't be afraid. Come say hi. Ask for a floating mana card. We will give them to you, 100%. But yeah, just MagicCon was awesome. Shout out to all the creators who gave us the time of day. Shout out to Howling Salt Mine. Shout out to Comedian, Scrybabies, Things in the Ice, Back on the Stack, and everyone else that we got games in. You are all awesome individuals, and we love the fact that this CEDH community is just full of great people. So,
Yep.
Yeah, that's my highlight. All right, yeah, let's look forward. What are you looking forward to for our second year of That's a Good Card?
I'm looking forward to seeing what cards we hear about when we go out to tournaments, when we go out to conventions, when people email us. Shout out to the one emailer.
Yeah, we have one person who emailed us out of nowhere. We barely even checked that mailbox.
I'm so excited. Like I said, I think CEDH is in a really cool spot. I think it's growing, and I'm so excited to talk about more cards. And I'm hoping that we grow to, I'm going to put out a outlandish 5,000 subscribers. That's what I'm really hoping and looking forward to.
Whoa, wait, across everything or just YouTube?
Just YouTube. That would be sick.
Just YouTube, wow. As of right now, we're at like 1,400 or something
So,
like that.
we have some
5K,
growing.
That's a tall task.
We have some growing.
We got some growing to do. I think that leads kind of into my looking towards the future, if you want to hand over the baton.
Yeah.
And that's that I want to really improve the quality of the podcast, specifically through editing. So I've been growing, self-taught when it comes to editing this thing. And I feel like I've gotten a lot more faster with it and
So
getting
good.
more efficient with it, to where audio quality is, more consistent. But there's a lot of improvements that we can do still. There's a lot of improvements. So whether that's getting better equipment, whether that's, changing my editing style, whether that's, potentially being able to afford buying better editing software rather, like Adobe products or something like that. I use everything free right now, so free versions of everything. I just want to improve the editing of this podcast. Who knows? Like, something I was thinking about was like, maybe we can put in like more little jingles, or we can put in sound effects, or we can do something, I don't know, make it sound a little more professional. I think we sound solid, but in order for us to achieve our goals, like, we can get better. We can get better for sure. So if you listeners have any suggestions for how we can improve the podcast and the quality of the podcast,
let us know.
Throw suggestions in the Discord. Yeah. I know our patrons already do that. So if you're a patron, I know we ask about getting feedback all the time in the patron channel. So just let us know. But that's my big point. Looking forward to the future is I just want to improve the quality of what we're putting out. Like, I don't want to cut corners. I want to make sure that every week we're putting out good stuff. So, cool. And then the second point that's less technical is just more collaborations.
Yeah,
and,
that was cool.
And more tournaments. Yeah. So we've been able to, we went on the stream for That's Not CEDH. Shout out those guys over there.
Things in the Ice.
Yeah, Things in the Ice is also another channel that we collaborated with. Shout out to Things in the Ice, guys. They're incredible. Yeah, it's just more collaborations overall would be great. I want to build the community, and especially once we start getting to the point where we have some traction. I also want to build up smaller creators just like other people did for us.
Yeah.
So hopefully
Huge.
we'll get to a point where if there's a new creator that comes around that is making good quality content, not cutting corners, like they're putting effort into this, like hell yeah, I want to see them succeed. 100,000 million %. Yeah, that's my looking towards the future. What do you got, y'all?
I went first.
I'm leaving that in. Oh my God. That's so funny. I'm just so used to that. That's just our style of podcast. Back.
Kyle,
forth,
wax
back, forth.
poetic.
And anyway, yeah, wax on, wax off. Anyway. Well, thank you so much, listeners, for listening to this wonderful closing segment. And thank you for listening to today's episode on Faerie Macabre. Huge shout out to Anna, aka Phyrexian
Thank you,
Fangirl,
Anna.
for inspiring us to do an episode on this card. And I hope to get a ton more games in with you in person and jam some more games. Listeners, now's a good time for you to take a look at the description down below where you'll find links to our link tree, where we have links to everywhere we post our podcasts, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube, as well as links to our Discord and Patreon. If you want to see more additional TAGC content, join the Patreon. We post extra podcast episodes and do patron callbacks where we go over old cards that we've reviewed and see where they're at and where they shape up in the meta. Cool. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for listening to our 1-year anniversary edition of the episode. I hope you enjoyed the special video message that I put in at the beginning of this podcast as well that Yaw doesn't know about.
Cut to his face
right now.
Right now.
He's just finding out right now. All right. See y'all later. See you next week. Thank you so much for 1 year. Happy anniversary. That's a good card. Peace.